Hey everyone, welcome back to Evil Shadow. Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. It all began on a chilly December evening when the first snow of the season blanketed our town. The streets glistened under the soft light of street lamps, and houses were adorned with twinkling Christmas decorations. Our living room was no exception. A towering Christmas tree stood in the corner, covered in glimmering ornaments, strings of lights, and a golden star perched at the top. But beneath the tree, something felt off. It was the first time we'd spent Christmas in this house, a charming but old Victorian home my parents had inherited from my great Aunt Eleanor. My mom loved its vintage charm, but I always felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the walls held secrets no one dared to speak of. That evening, as we sat together decorating the tree, I noticed a faint shadow beneath it. At first, I thought it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on me, but the more I looked, the more it seemed to shift, almost as if it were alive. I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired from unpacking all day. Looks perfect, doesn't it? Mom said, stepping back to admire the tree. I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, it's beautiful. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept glancing at the shadow, and each time, it seemed darker, more defined. It wasn't just the shadow of the tree. It was something else entirely. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint rustling sound. My room was directly above the living room, and it sounded like someone or something was moving around downstairs. At first, I thought it was my parents. Maybe they were adjusting the decorations or wrapping last-minute presents. But when I crept to the top of the stairs, the house was silent. Too silent. A cold draft swept through the hallway, making me shiver. I tiptoed down the stairs, my heart pounding with each step. As I reached the bottom, I froze. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights, but the shadow beneath it was no longer just a shadow. It had grown, stretched out like long, claw-like fingers curling outward. "Hello," I whispered, my voice trembling. The room answered with silence. Then, just as I turned to head back upstairs, I heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from beneath the tree. My blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, forming words I couldn't quite understand. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, overlapping and distorted. I bolted up the stairs, slamming my bedroom door behind me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, but the unease lingered. I didn't mention it to my parents. They were so excited about our first Christmas in the house, and I didn't want to ruin it. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Ornaments would fall off the tree without explanation. The lights would flicker, even though they were brand new. And the shadow, it seemed to grow darker with each passing day. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone, I felt a sudden chill. The room seemed to grow dim, even though the tree lights were on. I looked up and gasped. The shadow beneath the tree had taken on a humanoid shape, crouching as if ready to pounce. "Mom, Dad," I screamed, but by the time they rushed into the room, the shadow was gone. "What is it?" Mom asked, her face etched with concern. I hesitated. I thought I saw something. Dad chuckled nervously. "Probably just your imagination. This old house can play tricks on you." But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't my imagination. Determined to find answers, I started researching the history of the house. What I found sent shivers down my spine. In the late 1800s, a family had lived here, the Whitfields. They had a young daughter named Clara who loved Christmas more than anything. One year, tragedy struck. Clara's father, in a fit of rage over financial troubles, accidentally knocked over the Christmas tree while arguing with his wife. The tree caught fire, and Clara, who had been playing beneath it, was trapped in the flames. She didn't survive. Since then, the house had a reputation for being cursed. Families who lived here reported seeing shadows under their Christmas trees, hearing whispers, and feeling an oppressive presence during the holidays. Most dismissed it as urban legend, but I knew better. Clara's spirit was still here. On Christmas Eve, I decided to confront whatever was lurking beneath the tree. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I waited until my parents were asleep. The house was eerily quiet as I crept into the living room. The shadow was there, darker and more menacing than ever. My hands trembled as I shone the flashlight beneath the tree. At first, there was nothing, but then the shadow began to move, coalescing into the shape of a little girl. "Clara," I whispered. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes staring into mine. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming sadness, as if I could feel her pain and longing. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." The shadow hesitated, then slowly reached out toward me. Its touch was icy, sending a jolt through my body. Suddenly, the lights on the tree flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights came back on, the shadow was gone. The next morning, we found the tree toppled over, ornaments shattered across the floor. My parents blamed it on the old stand, but I knew the truth. Clara's spirit had moved on, her pain finally acknowledged. Christmas morning felt lighter, as if the house itself had been cleansed. The oppressive heaviness that had lingered since we moved in was gone, and yet a faint sadness remained. Clara's story had left an indelible mark on me. We've had many Christmases since, but I've never forgotten that night. The shadow under the tree may be gone, but every year, as I decorate the tree, I can't help but feel a faint, lingering chill. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear the faintest whisper of a little girl's laughter. Years later, while unpacking old holiday decorations, I found a small wooden box tucked away in the attic. Inside was a photograph of the Whitfield family. Clara's wide, innocent eyes stared back at me, and my breath caught in my throat. Beneath the photo was a charred ornament, a tiny glass angel, its edges blackened by fire. I held the ornament in my hands, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, I placed the angel on our Christmas tree. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, as if Clara was finally at rest. The shadow never returned, but her memory lives on, etched in the light of a single, glowing ornament. It was a cold, misty evening when I first heard about the vanishing road. My friend Mark and I were sitting by the fireplace at his cabin, sharing ghost stories to pass the time. Outside, the wind howled through the barren trees, and the snowstorm that had been forecasted was just starting to settle in. Mark, always the skeptic, leaned back in his chair and smirked as he began his tale. "They say there's a stretch of road not far from here that disappears after sunset," he began, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Drivers who find themselves on it at night report strange things. Lights in the trees, whispers in the wind, and sometimes they never find their way out." I roll my eyes. "Come on, Mark. Sounds like a campfire story to me." He shrugged. "Believe what you want, but people swear by it. It's called Black Hollow Road, and it's just a couple of miles from here." The name sent an unexplainable chill down my spine, but I didn't let it show. "Let's go then," I challenged, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's see if this disappearing road is real." Mark's smirk widened into a grin. "Are you serious? In this weather? What better time?" I shot back, though the rational part of me was screaming to stay put. And so, against better judgment, we set out into the night. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the world in eerie silence. Mark drove while I navigated, the GPS directing us toward Black Hollow Road. The closer we got, the more the world seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The headlights of Mark's old pickup truck barely cut through the fog that had settled like a ghostly veil over the landscape. Finally, we reached the entrance. A weathered sign barely visible through the snow read, Black Hollow Road. Beneath it, someone had scrawled in red paint, "Turn back." Mark laughed nervously, very welcoming. I didn't respond. My eyes were fixed on the road ahead, which seemed to disappear into the fog. "Let's go," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. The truck crept forward, the tires crunching over the snow-covered gravel. The further we drove, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The fog thickened, swirling around us like living tendrils. The trees seemed to press closer, their gnarled branches arching overhead to form a tunnel. Even the sound of the truck's engine seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "This is creepy," Mark admitted, his usual bravado faltering. "You sure you want to keep going?" "What? Are you scared?" I teased, though my voice was shaky. Before he could respond, the truck's headlights flickered. Mark cursed under his breath, tapping the dashboard. "Great, just what we need." The lights steadied, but the truck suddenly lurched to a stop. Mark tried the ignition, but the engine only sputtered. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. We sat in tense silence for a moment, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, a low, mournful hum. It seemed to come from all around us, reverberating through the air. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mark nodded, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" We stepped out of the truck, the cold biting through our coats. The hum grew louder, shifting into a melody that was both haunting and beautiful. It seemed to come from deeper down the road, beckoning us forward. "Let's check it out," Mark said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Reluctantly, I followed. The snow crunched underfoot as we walked, the fog parting just enough to reveal the road ahead. But something was wrong. The trees on either side of us were no longer the barren, winter-stripped trunks we'd seen before. They were lush and green, their leaves shimmering as if touched by moonlight. Fireflies danced among the branches, their glow casting eerie patterns on the ground. "This doesn't make sense," I murmured. "It's winter." Mark didn't respond. He was staring at something further ahead. I followed his gaze and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road, shrouded in mist. It was a woman, her long hair flowing like liquid shadow. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to shift between black and white, and her eyes, or what should have been her eyes, were empty voids. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice cracking. The woman tilted her head, as if curious. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked into the fog. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, we followed. The road stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the world around us. The hum had returned, louder and more discordant, like a choir of voices singing in agony. The fireflies' glow dimmed, replaced by an unnatural darkness that seemed to pulse with life. "I don't think this is a good idea," I said, my voice trembling. "We should go back." Mark nodded, but when we turned around, the road behind us was gone. In its place was an impenetrable wall of trees. "What the hell?" Mark whispered. He stepped forward, pressing his hand against the bark. It felt solid, unyielding. "This wasn't here before." Panic set in. "We're trapped," I said, my breath coming in short gasps. "No," Mark said, trying to stay calm. "There's got to be another way out. We just need to keep moving." But the road ahead was no longer the same. The asphalt had disappeared, replaced by cobblestones slick with moss. The air grew heavy, carrying the scent of decay. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, darting between the trees. "Do you see that?" I asked, clutching Mark's arm. "See what?" he replied, his eyes darting around. "The shadows," I said. "They're watching us." As we walked, the whispers began, faint at first, like leaves rustling in the wind, but they grew louder, forming words that chilled me to my core. "Turn back. You don't belong here. This is the end." Then we saw it, a decrepit wooden sign hanging crookedly from a post. Carved into the wood were the words, "Welcome to Black Hollow." Beneath it, the phrase, "No escape," was scrawled in what looked like dried blood. "This can't be real," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, my heart pounding. "I think we're not in our world anymore." Before he could respond, the ground beneath us began to shake. The cobblestones cracked, and from the fissures emerged skeletal hands, their bony fingers clawing at the air. We stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows closed in, their shapes becoming more defined. They were people, or what was left of them, hollow-eyed and gaunt, their faces twisted in eternal agony. "Help us," they moaned, their voices overlapping in a horrifying symphony. Mark grabbed a fallen branch, wielding it like a weapon. "Stay back," he yelled, though his voice shook with fear. The figures didn't stop. They moved closer, their skeletal hands reaching out. I could feel their cold, clammy touch on my skin, and it took everything in me not to scream. "We have to do something," I cried. "Like what?" Mark shouted back, swinging the branch wildly. Then in the distance, I saw her, the woman from before. She stood at the edge of the road, her empty eyes locked on mine. Somehow, I knew she was the key. "Mark, follow me," I yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward her. As we approached, the shadows seemed to recoil, their forms dissolving into the mist. The woman raised a hand, and the world around us began to warp. The trees twisted, the cobblestones crumbled, and the fog thickened until I couldn't see anything. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. We found ourselves back at the entrance to Black Hollow Road. The snowstorm had passed, and the world was silent once more. The truck was parked where we'd left it, the engine purring softly as if it had never stalled. Mark and I exchanged a look, our faces pale and drawn. Neither of us spoke as we climbed into the truck and drove away. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Was it a hallucination, a shared nightmare, or had we truly crossed into another realm? All I know is that I'll never set foot on Black Hollow Road again. Because some roads are meant to be forgotten, there's secrets left buried in the fog. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air as the Peterson family prepared for Christmas. Their front door displayed a magnificent wreath, crafted from evergreen branches, holly, and crimson ribbons. It was a gift from a neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, who was known for her elaborate holiday decorations. "Isn't it lovely?" Linda Peterson admired the wreath as she adjusted it on the door. Her husband, Mark, nodded, though he had always found Mrs. Hargrove's creations to be a bit unsettling. The wreath was unlike any Mark had ever seen. The holly berries were an unnaturally deep red, almost like drops of blood. The evergreen branches seemed to twist into claw-like shapes, and the ribbons seemed to glisten as though they were wet. Their teenage daughter, Emily, glanced at it and shivered. "It's creepy," she muttered. "Nonsense," Linda replied, brushing off her daughter's unease. "It's a work of art." But as the days passed, the wreath began to change. On the second night after the wreath was hung, Mark woke to a faint scratching sound. He blinked in the darkness, his ears straining. It was soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but then it grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails scraping against wood. He crept out of bed and toward the front door. As he approached, the scratching stopped. Everything was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He flicked on the porch light and peered out the window. The wreath hung motionless, its crimson ribbon swaying gently in the breeze. Just the wind, he muttered, though he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, Linda noticed something strange. The wreath's holly berries had darkened, turning a bruised purple. The ribbons, once vibrant, now looked faded and frayed. Must be the weather, she said, though the words sounded hollow, even to her. By the fourth night, the wreath had begun to spread. Small tendrils of evergreen extended from its base, curling around the doorframe like creeping vines. Mark noticed it first when he returned from work. "Linda, have you seen this?" he called. Linda frowned as she examined the door. Maybe Mrs. Hargrove used some kind of growing plant? Mark shook his head. That doesn't make sense. It's a wreath, not a garden. Emily refused to walk past it. "It's alive," she whispered, clutching her arms. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong with it." Linda dismissed her fears, but even she had begun to feel uneasy. At night, she swore she heard faint whispers coming from the front door, like distant voices carried on the wind. The Petersons decided to visit Mrs. Hargrove to ask about the wreath. When they arrived, her house was dark, the curtains drawn tight. After several minutes of knocking, the door creaked open. Mrs. Hargrove appeared, her face pale and drawn. "The wreath," Linda began. "It's changing." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes widened in fear. "You hung it on your door?" Linda nodded. "Of course. You gave it to us." Mrs. Hargrove shook her head violently. "That wasn't meant for you. It wasn't meant for anyone." "What are you talking about?" Mark demanded. The old woman's voice trembled. "That wreath was made from cursed branches, wood taken from the Blackwood forest. They say the forest is haunted, its trees feeding on the souls of the lost. I didn't mean to give it to you. It was a mistake." Mark's stomach dropped. "How do we get rid of it?" Mrs. Hargrove's voice dropped to a whisper. "You can't. Once it's claimed a home, it won't leave willingly." By the time they returned home, the wreath had grown even larger. It now covered the entire door, its dark tendrils snaking along the walls and onto the porch. The holly berries pulsed faintly, like beating hearts. Emily refused to enter the house. "We can't stay here," she cried. "It's going to kill us." Mark grabbed a pair of garden shears and approached the wreath, determined to cut it down. But as he raised the shears, the tendrils sprang to life, wrapping around his wrists and pulling him toward the door. "Mark!" Linda screamed, grabbing his arm and yanking him back. The tendrils released him, but not before leaving deep, red welts on his skin. "We have to leave," Mark gasped, his voice shaking. But as they turned to go, they realized the tendrils had spread across the porch, blocking their path. The house groaned as if alive, the walls trembling with a low, guttural sound. Desperate, the Petersons retreated to the living room, barricading themselves inside. The wreath's tendrils crept closer, seeping through cracks in the walls and under the door, grew thick with the smell of decay, and the whispers grew louder, forming incoherent words that filled their minds with dread. Emily clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face. "What does it want?" Mark stared at the encroaching vines, his heart pounding. "It's feeding off us. Our fear, our energy." Linda's eyes widened as she remembered Mrs. Hargrove's warning. The Blackwood forest. The curse came from there. Maybe we can return it. Mark grabbed the wreath's base, ignoring the searing pain as the tendrils writhed against his skin. With a primal scream, he tore it from the door. The house shook violently, the walls cracking as the wreath let out an unearthly howl. The Petersons drove through the night, the cursed wreath bundled in a tarp in the trunk. The roads were eerily empty, the forest looming ahead like a dark maw. When they reached the edge of the Blackwood Forest, they hesitated. The air was deathly still, the trees towering like silent sentinels. Mark carried the wreath to the forest's edge, his hands trembling. "What now?" Linda whispered. "We burn it," Mark said, his voice firm. He doused the wreath in gasoline and lit a match. As the flames engulfed it, the wreath writhed violently, emitting a high-pitched screech. The fire spread to the surrounding branches, the cursed energy dissipating into the night. When the Petersons returned home, the house was eerily quiet. The tendrils were gone, the door frame restored to its original state. But the memory of the wreath lingered, its sinister presence etched into their minds. Years later, Emily would still wake in the middle of the night, hearing faint whispers carried on the wind. And every Christmas, the Petersons would forego decorations, their home bare but safe. But somewhere, deep in the heart of the Blackwood Forest, a new wreath began to grow, its holly berries glistening like blood, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim.